3 months after I moved to the Philippines, I stopped eating real meals. Not because food was hard to find. It was everywhere, cheap, and honestly pretty good. I stopped eating because somewhere between the second month and the third, I just stopped caring about most things. I'd wake up, make instant coffee, sit on the small porch outside my apartment, and stare at the street below until noon. I didn't tell my son back in Oregon. I didn't tell my sister in Arizona. I didn't tell the few guys I still kept in touch with from my old job. I figured if I said it out loud, that I was sitting alone in a foreign country, feeling like a man who had made the worst decision of his 64 years on this earth, then it would become real in a way I couldn't walk back from. My name is Frank, and about 8 months before that, I had sold my house, my truck, most of my furniture, and everything else I couldn't pack into 2 suitcases and a carry-on. I want to be honest about why I did it, because I've seen a lot of these stories told in a way that makes the person sound either brave or foolish, and I don't think I was either one. I was just tired. Tired of watching my savings shrink every year, even though I wasn't doing anything extravagant. Tired of a grocery bill that kept going up. Tired of the property taxes on a house I was rattling around in alone. My wife, Sandra, had passed 4 years before I made the move. My son, Nathan, had his own family in Portland. 2 kids, a mortgage, a life that didn't have much room for a retired widower who called too often. From the outside, things looked fine. I had my Social Security. I had a small pension from the county, where I'd worked for 22 years in public works. I had about $190,000 from the sale of the house after everything was settled. That's not a small amount of money. But I had watched 3 different friends postpone retirement because they couldn't make the math work, and I knew what that road looked like. I didn't want to spend the next 15 years pinching every dollar and waiting for something to change. I started watching videos late at night. That's how it begins for most people, I think. You're not looking for anything specific. You're just looking. I stumbled into the expat community online almost by accident. A video about a guy living in Cebu on less than $1,500 a month, then another, then another. I started doing the math myself. I have a spreadsheet background from years of managing project budgets, so I ran the numbers pretty carefully. Healthcare, cost of a decent apartment, food, transportation, even accounting for trips back home once a year, the numbers kept coming out the same way. It was possible, not lavish, not irresponsible, possible. What I didn't account for, and I want to say this clearly because I think it's the part nobody talks about, was the cost of starting over, not in dollars. In something harder to measure. The house sold in 3 weeks, faster than I expected. One Saturday morning I put it on the market, and by the following Thursday I had an offer I couldn't justify refusing. After that, things happened quickly in the way that only happens when you've already made the real decision, and everything else is just execution. I sold the truck to my neighbor's kid for $8,000. I rented a storage unit for a few things I couldn't bring myself to get rid of: Sandra's rocking chair, some boxes from the garage, a set of tools my father had given me. Everything else either went to Nathan, went to Goodwill, or went to the curb. There was an afternoon, about 2 weeks before my flight, when I was going through the hall closet and found a shoebox of old photographs. Nathan as a little kid, missing his front teeth, standing in front of a Christmas tree. Sandra in her 20s, before I even knew her, laughing at something off camera. My mother and father at a picnic table I didn't recognize. I sat on the floor of that closet for a long time. I'm not sure how long. My son, Nathan, had been worried from the beginning. Not angry. He's not a person who gets angry easily, but worried in that quiet way he has, where he asks very specific practical questions to avoid talking about how he actually feels. He asked about healthcare. He asked about the visa process. He asked what would happen if I got sick. I didn't have good answers for all of it. I had researched the SRRV retirement visa and had a general plan, but a general plan is not the same as certainty, and we both knew it. The last night in the house, there was nothing left to sit on. I'd given the furniture to Nathan and his wife, Claire, the weekend before. I ate a sandwich standing at the kitchen counter, walked through the empty rooms one more time, and tried to make some kind of peace with what I was doing. The rooms were strange without furniture. Smaller. The carpet had those flat rectangular impressions where the couch and the bed and the dresser had been for years. I looked at those impressions for a while. I locked the front door at 6:15 in the morning and left the key with the realtor's lockbox. I had lived in that house for 19 years. Sandra and I had bought it the year Nathan started high school. I didn't let myself think too hard about it at the time. You can only handle so much at once. The flight was long in the way that international flights are long when you're traveling alone and don't sleep well. 2 connections, a lot of bad airplane food, and about 22 hours of total travel time. I arrived in Dumaguete exhausted and slightly bewildered, with 2 suitcases and a carry-on and $190,000 sitting in an account back home, and no furniture, and no house, and no plan except the general one. The apartment I'd arranged before leaving was modest by American standards, and comfortable by any honest measure. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, an air conditioner that worked most of the time, and a balcony that looked out over a side street. Walking distance to the market, to a few restaurants I started recognizing within the first week, and to the boulevard along the water where I started taking morning walks. The first few weeks were genuinely good. I want to say that plainly because I've heard people tell these stories where everything goes wrong immediately, and that's not what happened. Everything was interesting. The food was different, and I liked most of it. The people I encountered were friendly in a direct and unself-conscious way I wasn't expecting. I met a few other Americans and Australians who had made similar moves, some recently, some years ago, and they all had stories that felt like variations on my own. Early mornings on the boulevard, the particular quality of light in the late afternoon, the sounds of the neighborhood at different hours. There was a period, probably covering the first month and a half, where I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. More like alertness, like I was paying attention to things again. Then, somewhere around week 7 or 8, that feeling started to thin out. It didn't disappear all at once. It was more like the way light changes in the late afternoon. You don't notice it happening, and then you look up and it's darker than it was an hour ago, and you can't say exactly when it changed. The novelty faded. The morning walks became routine, which sounds like it should be a good thing, but the routine felt hollow in a way I hadn't expected. I started noticing things that bothered me. Small things. The internet going down at inconvenient times. Bureaucratic delays I didn't have the patience for. The noise from the street below my apartment that I'd found charming in the first weeks, and now just found loud. I was calling Nathan more often. More than I wanted to admit. Not because I had things to tell him, but because his voice was familiar, and familiar felt like something I was running low on. One Tuesday morning he sent me a video. Just a short clip from his phone. His daughter, my granddaughter Sophie, learning to ride a bike in their driveway. Claire was running alongside her, laughing. Nathan was filming. Sophie was wobbling and concentrating with that expression kids get when they're trying very hard not to fall. I watched that video 4 times sitting on my balcony with my coffee. The 4th time something shifted in my chest. Not a dramatic thing. Just a small, quiet shifting. She was learning to ride a bike, and I wasn't there. It sounds simple when I say it that way. But I sat with it for a while, and it didn't feel simple. That afternoon I caught myself looking at houses online. I told myself I was just curious. Just keeping an eye on the market. That's what you tell yourself. By the 3rd month, the thought of going home was not a passing thing anymore. It was there in the morning when I woke up, and there at night when I was trying to sleep, and there in the middle of the afternoon when the street below was loud and the internet was slow, and I hadn't spoken to anyone in English for 2 days. I started calculating things. How much would it cost to rent somewhere in Arizona near my sister? Could I stay with Nathan for a few months while I figured things out? Was there a graceful way to explain to everyone that I'd spent 18 months planning this move and now I was coming back 3 months in? I didn't have a graceful answer, but I started building one in my head, the way you do when you've already made a decision you haven't admitted to yourself yet. One evening, late in the 3rd month, I opened the airline website, just to look, to see what was available. I booked a flight 40 minutes later. I stared at the confirmation email for a long time. Part of me felt something close to relief. Part of me felt something I can only describe as a specific kind of shame. Not the dramatic kind, just the quiet kind you feel when you've done something you already knew was wrong before you did it. I didn't call Nathan. I didn't text my sister. I thought I'd wait until I was closer to the departure date, then explain things in a way that sounded considered. I had 6 weeks. Plenty of time to come up with a version of the story that held together. What happened instead was that I felt worse. Not worse about the Philippines. Not worse about the apartment or the street noise or the slow internet. Just worse in a general way that I couldn't locate or explain. The flight was booked. The plan was made. I should have felt settled. Instead, I felt like I was dragging something heavy around with me, and I couldn't tell whether the weight was regret about leaving or something older that I'd brought with me from Oregon and hadn't sorted out yet. A couple of weeks after I booked the ticket, I was walking along the boulevard in the early evening. I wasn't headed anywhere specific. I was just walking the way you walk when you don't know what else to do with yourself. The light was good in that particular way. It gets around sunset there. Orange and flat and warm. I passed a small outdoor place I'd been to a couple of times, plastic chairs and cold drinks. Nothing fancies. An American named Warren was sitting there, someone I'd run into a few times over the previous months. He was in his early 70s, gray beard, the relaxed posture of someone who had stopped being in a hurry a long time ago. He waved me over, asked how things were going. I don't know why I told him the truth. Maybe because he was the first person I'd spoken to face in a few days. Maybe because I was tired of carrying it. I told him I was going home. Told him I had the flight booked. Told him I didn't think this was working. He listened, nodded a few times, took a drink from his glass. Then he asked me how long I'd been planning the move before I came. I told him about 1.5 years. He asked how long I'd actually been living here. I said 3 months. He didn't laugh. He just set down his glass and looked at me with the expression of a man who has heard some version of this conversation before. He said, "You spent 18 months preparing for a life you've had for 3 months." I didn't have anything to say to that. He told me about his own first year. The homesickness. The mornings where he'd wake up and spend the first hour of the day listing reasons he should go home. The constant comparing. Everything measured against what it would have been like back in California, where he was from. He said there was a specific period around month 4 where he was absolutely convinced he had made a catastrophic mistake, and that the only thing that kept him from leaving was that his apartment lease had 2 months left, and he was too practical to eat the deposit. I laughed at that. First time I'd laughed in a while. Before I left that evening, he said something I've thought about nearly every day since. He said, "The feeling you're describing isn't homesickness, it's withdrawal. You're withdrawing from certainty. And withdrawal always feels like the thing itself." I walked back to my apartment slowly. I sat on the balcony for a long time that night. I kept turning over what he'd said. Withdrawal from certainty. I'd spent 64 years building a life where I mostly knew what tomorrow would look like. Same county job, same house, same town, same grocery store, same routes, same rhythms. Sandra and I had built our life around those rhythms together. When she died, those rhythms became the thing holding me together rather than just the context of our life. And then I'd picked them up and thrown them out and moved to the other side of the world, and I was surprised that it felt like something was missing. It wasn't the Philippines that felt wrong. It was the uncertainty itself. And uncertainty is not the same as a mistake. I held on to that for a few days. I'm not going to pretend it resolved everything. It didn't. I still looked at that confirmation email a few times. Still picked up the phone to call Nathan and tell him I was coming home, and then set it back down without dialing. About 4 days after I talked to Warren, I pulled up the reservation and sat with it for a long time. Then I called the airline. I'd bought travel protection, an add-on I almost skipped because it seemed like unnecessary caution. It didn't seem unnecessary now. I got most of the fare back. The flight disappeared. For the first time in weeks, I went to bed that night without that specific weight. I gave myself 90 days. That was the deal I made with myself. 90 days from that point. And if I still felt the same way, I could leave knowing I had been fair about it. No question marks. No years of wondering. I want to tell you the next 90 days were a transformation. A revelation. Some kind of movie moment where everything became clear. That's not what happened. What happened was slower and less dramatic and honestly, more convincing because of it. About 2 weeks in, I noticed I had stopped converting prices to dollars. Small thing. But for the first 2 months, I had been doing it constantly. This costs this much in pesos, which is this many dollars, which is what I would have spent on that back home. One morning I paid for breakfast without doing the conversion. And I didn't realize I hadn't done it until I was halfway back to my apartment. I started having a regular morning at a place a few blocks from my building. Same table, same order most days, a coffee, and whatever they had for breakfast. The woman who ran the place, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Tessie, started having my coffee ready when she saw me walking down the street. That's a small thing too, but it didn't feel small. I made a few decisions about how I was spending my time. I found a community of retirees, American, Australian, a few Europeans, who gathered a couple of afternoons a week at a place near the water. Cards sometimes, conversation mostly, complaining about things in the affectionate way that people who have chosen an unconventional life complain about its inconveniences. I started showing up. At first I felt like a visitor. Then I felt like a regular. Then one afternoon I realized I had introduced a newly arrived guy from Minnesota to 3 different people, as though I were the one who belonged there and he was the newcomer. I had been there 7 months by then. I still called Nathan every week. That didn't change. But the calls changed in texture. Less me searching for something to say. More me having things to tell him. Sophie had started losing her baby teeth. I sent her a postcard with a painted fish on it, and she apparently put it on her wall. Claire sent me a photo of it. I looked at that photo for a while too, but it felt different than the bike video had felt. Less like loss. More like connection across a distance. I'm not going to tell you there aren't hard days. There are. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes around the holidays that I haven't fully solved. I flew back to Portland for Christmas last year. It was the right decision, and I don't regret it. But getting on the return flight was harder than I expected. Sitting in the airport in Portland with my boarding pass, watching Nathan and Claire, and the kids get smaller as I went through security, I felt every mile of that distance. But here is what I know now that I didn't know when I booked that flight home at 3 months in. The hard days are not the whole story. They never are. They're just loud, and when you're in one, it's easy to mistake the volume for significance. About 2 months after the 90 days were up, I applied for the SRRV retirement visa. There are different categories depending on your situation. I went with the option that fit my pension and savings best. The process took longer than I hoped and involved more paperwork than I would have preferred, but it got done. Having that sorted out made something shift in how I thought about being there. I wasn't a tourist making a long visit. I was a resident figuring out a life. I found a better apartment, too. Queter Street. Better light. A kitchen I could actually cook in. I started cooking again. Something I hadn't done much of since Sandra died. Nothing complicated. But having a meal I made myself at a table I sat down at felt like something. Hard to explain exactly. Just something. The money situation has worked out better than I feared. My monthly expenses run somewhere between $400 and $700 depending on the month. That includes rent, Food, utilities, getting around, the occasional meal out, and a cushion for unexpected things. My Social Security and pension together clear that comfortably, which means I'm not touching the savings for living expenses. For the first time in the last few years before the move, I stopped having that low-level anxiety about outliving my money. That sounds like a small thing. It isn't. I want to say something about healthcare, because I know it's the first thing most Americans ask about. I'm not going to pretend it's the same as having good insurance in the States, because it isn't. I got a comprehensive international health policy through a company that covers expats. It cost me more than I wanted to spend but less than my old premiums. And for routine things, the local hospitals have been fine. For anything serious, I have a plan, and I have the financial cushion to execute it. I thought through this carefully before I committed, and I'd encourage anyone considering this kind of move to do the same. Don't wing it on healthcare. What I didn't plan well was the timeline. I planned the finances. I researched the visa. I researched the neighborhoods. I watched more videos than I want to admit. But I underestimated how long it actually takes a place to feel like yours. Not familiar. Not comfortable. Yours. That took longer than I expected. Not years, but longer than 3 months, which is when I almost left. There are things I still miss. I miss Nathan in a straightforward way I don't try to explain away. I miss being in the same time zone as the people I love, so I can call them without calculating the hours first. I miss the ease of certain things. Driving, mostly, and the particular efficiency of American grocery stores, which I always complained about when I lived there, and now occasionally think about with something close to fondness. But when I sit on my balcony in the morning, the new apartment, quieter street, better light, and I have my coffee and watch the neighborhood wake up, I don't feel like a man who made a mistake. I feel like a man who got close to quitting something that turned out to be worth staying for. Warren and I still get coffee when our schedules line up. He's got a dry sense of humor and a seemingly bottomless supply of observations about human nature. A few months ago, I told him that what he said that evening on the boulevard had probably kept me from getting on the plane. He shrugged and said he'd been on the receiving end of a similar conversation in his own first year, from someone who'd been there even longer. He said the thing gets passed along. I've thought about that. The idea that people who figured something out make themselves available to people who haven't yet. That the information flows forward through these small, unremarkable conversations between strangers at plastic tables on side streets in cities far from home. If you're considering a move like this, I want to tell you what I wish someone had said clearly to me before I went. The first 3 months are not representative, maybe not even the first 6. You will have days where it feels wrong in a bone-deep way, and that feeling will be very convincing, and it will lie to you. It will tell you that the wrongness is the place when most of the time the wrongness is the adjustment, and those are not the same thing. Give yourself more time than you think you need. Have your finances genuinely figured out, not approximately figured out. Have a real plan for healthcare, not a vague intention to sort it out. Keep one foot connected to home. Visit when you need to. Call when you need to. Don't try to sever things cleanly because clean severance isn't how people actually work. And if you find yourself at month 3 with a flight booked and a confirmation email you keep reading at 2 in the morning, try talking to someone who's been there longer than you have. You might find out that what you're feeling has a name and that it passes, and that the life on the other side of it is the one you came for. I almost didn't stay long enough to find that out. 3 months in, sitting on that porch with my instant coffee and my dwindling appetite, I was a few clicks from erasing everything I'd built here before it had a chance to become anything. I'm glad I didn't get on that plane. Not because everything is perfect, it isn't, but because better than what I had turned out to be enough. And enough, I've learned, is worth crossing an ocean for.